Hey there, 251ers. Welcome back. Welcome back. It's a little chilly in here, so I got my thinking cap on. Today, we are going to go through a really important, I think interesting, but pretty easy, hopefully, lecture talking about food webs, aka energy flow in ecosystems. So when we think about energy flow, it's basically where is the carbon moving? And when we are thinking about where is the carbon moving, we're really thinking about ecosystems and food webs and ecology. And this is like my bread and butter. This is stuff I really love. I like talking about. So hopefully today, we'll see. I'm gonna start off and say I don't think it's going to be that long, but let's see what happens. But it'll be, and hopefully you'll think it's as interesting as I do. So energy flow in the oceans is unidirectional from primary producers to higher trophic levels. Boop, only basically food. Carbon is made, organic carbon, right? Carbon dioxide is inorganic carbon. Organic carbon, so sugar and all of the wonderful things that make up biomass and us as animals, is made by the primary producers. Those primary producers are eaten by herbivores. Those herbivores are eaten by carnivores or possibly omnivores, and then those things are eaten by larger, so on, up to the top of the food chain. You'll learn food web is a better way to think about it, and there's different levels of a food web, not necessarily a single organism at the top. A biotic community is an assemblage of organisms, indefinable area. Can be one or multiple species, genera, families, etc. So a biotic community would be like all of the animals that live at a coral reef. That would be a biotic community. And how about all of the animals or organisms that live at a coral reef in the Gulf of Mexico? That would be a biotic community. An ecosystem is a biotic community plus the environment around it. And that would be the coral reef ecosystem, which includes the water that moves in and out and the atmosphere above it that impacts the temperature. Right? So biotic community is really the organisms that live in this particular area. Ecosystem is everything around it. And it says can be one or multiple species. One species is actually an example of a subsurface environment, a South African gold mine, as a matter of fact, where they did some work and found that the microbial community in that particular system seems to be dominated by one organism that can do everything that it needs to be an ecosystem. So can be one, that's very rare, usually it's multiple. So community, ecosystem. Ecosystem's all of this stuff, includes the environment. Community is just the organisms in that ecosystem. So there are three major types of organisms that we think about if you're going to define them at their broadest sense. There's producers, consumers, decomposers. Producers nourish themselves, so it says, with photosynthesis or chemosynthesis. These are your primary producers. They're autotrophic. Things like phytoplankton, sulfide oxidizing bacteria at vents, iron oxidizing bacteria in coastal areas where there's a mix of iron and a little bit of oxygen. Anything that's basically performing carbon fixation, taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere or out of the water and turning it into sugar. There's 6 different ways to do that, by the way. Rubisco, which is what these organisms use, is one of them, but there's a bunch of other pathways, the Wood-Lungdahl pathway, there's a bunch of other ones out there too. 6 to be exact. Consumers eat other organisms. That means they can't make their own carbon. Generally, they can't make their own carbon. There's something called mixotrophic where they do both. But let's not worry about that right now. So these we would call heterotrophic. We, 251ers, all of us in this class. Doesn't matter if you're vegan. Doesn't matter if all you eat is steak and you've never seen a plant in your life. We are all heterotrophic. Can be herbivores like myself and copepods. Can be carnivores, like sharks. No matter what you think about yourself and how meaty you might be, no human is actually a carnivore. That was just a joke I made just earlier, but no human is a carnivore because we have to eat plants on some level, so that makes us either herbivores or omnivores, where omnivores eat plants and meat, right? So I'm a herbivore. Most humans are omnivores. And dinoflagellates. We talked about dinoflagellates. Harmful algal blooms, they're a type of phytoplankton, but it's actually a really broad group. And dinoflagellates can ingest pre-made organic carbon, as well as most of them are also, or many of them are also photosynthetic. So they're considered omnivores. So you have your producers, you have your consumers. Somebody's got to make the sugar, somebody's going to be eating it. And then you have your decomposers, which break down dead organisms or waste. In the ocean, we call this stuff detritus. These are also heterotrophs, right? But they're eating stuff that's dead. Consumers are eating stuff that's alive. Yeah, or that they killed and then ate. I was going to say, I was thinking about people, right? And we generally don't. Sometimes we eat our plants live, but we don't really eat animals live very often without cooking them. I guess sushi would be an example. Anyway, decomposers are things that are breaking down dead waste, right? Dead matter. And so fungi is a really good example of these, right? But there are also animals that are decomposers. And so a good animal example would be vultures. We have lots of vultures here in College Station. I think they're the black turkey vultures that we call them. They got the black heads, not the red heads. I got a ton of those things in my neighborhood. They're pretty fascinating birds. So all three of these, very important. If you don't have any one of them, you're in trouble. If you don't have primary producers, you don't have an ecosystem, right? The bigger that base is, the more stuff you can have at top, and you can learn why pretty soon. And then if you have primary producers, you need something to eat them, otherwise they just go unabated, which maybe is not the end of the world, but probably they'll end up doing something harmful to themselves if they're just allowed to run free, unabated or unchecked. And if you don't have decomposers, you're going to have dead stuff piled up to the outer space, pretty much. So you have to have something that breaks down the dead stuff. Even if it's microbes. Microbes are largely what does this, but sometimes there are animals and things like fungi, which can be microbial or macrocellular, multicellular. Okay, so in thinking about how these three different types of organisms fit into a food web, usually they're placed in a trophic level. Trophic level is basically a feeding stage. Chemical energy is transferred from producers, think of these algae, right, phytoplankton, or other primary producers in the ocean, to consumers. Only about 10% of energy is transferred to the next trophic level. Ta-da! Remember that number. Feeding populations are generally slightly larger in body size than their prey. I should say generally should be underlined because this is not always the case. And I'll give you some exceptions. Exception 1, blue whales. They're about 30 meters long, 100 feet long. They eat krill, which are 6 centimeters long. So they're many orders of magnitude larger than their prey. But one of the things with this exception is that the blue whale is the very top of the food web and it's eating very low on the food web. There's more energy at lower parts of the food web because you lose 90% of your energy at each successive stage. And so if you want to be big, you have to eat low on the food web. There's no such thing as a super duper ultra massive predator unless there's really big food to support that predator, right? You think of megalodons, everything was big back then, right? Megalodons were huge, but everything else was even bigger. And I would argue there are some other exceptions. Apex predators are usually smaller than their prey, or similar size at the largest. Think about Tyrannosaurus rex. What did Tyrannosaurus rex eat? It ate Alamosaurus, which is this giant theropod. Theropod? Sauropod. Giant sauropod, right? The four-legged things with the long necks and the tails. Right? That's pretty common. So they're definitely exceptions. But in general, feeding populations a little bigger than their body size and their prey. Think about like wolves and rabbits, right? Yeah. Humans are actually a good exception to this rule, right? We eat things of various sizes. Okay, so getting back to the idea of trophic levels, right? These are just feeding levels. And so the primary producers would be obviously one. This is an example of a trophic level from Antarctica, the Antarctic food web. It's grouped by feeding stages, also known as trophic levels. And at the bottom, we have producers, and the primary consumers, aka the herbivores, would be the copepods and the krill. These are the things that eat the diatoms. They're bigger than diatoms. Actually, they're quite a bit larger than diatoms. Copepods, a little bit, krill, much bigger. That's not that complicated. However, where it gets complicated is here, secondary level, where you have your primary carnivores, or omnivores, I don't know, maybe some plants too, right? But so they're eating the copepods, but they're also being eaten by step above them. So it gets pretty complicated in the middle of this, right? And then these basically, so we have penguins, petrels, which is kind of bird, amphipods, which are larger than krill, and look like giant shrimp, basically. But we also have things like seals and baleen whales, blue whales, boom. Diatoms, krill, blue whales. That's a really short food chain, right? Food web is all of these things and all the interactions. Food chain is kind of a one unidirectional thing. And baleen whales, there's then several other levels of this food web depending on what the things are eating. So emperor penguin eats some of these small fishes that might eat the copepods, right? So it has to be one level up. Like Adelie penguin, also they don't necessarily eat the small fishes, they're eating these krill and copepods. So they have to be a level below the emperor penguin. And then there's leopard weddell seals and leopard seals, and so kind of going up. And all the way at the top are killer whales. We're going to talk about them in the chapter that we talk about whales, which is the next chapter. Killer whales are the apex predators in the ocean. They eat everything. So they're always going to be the top of your food web if they're in the area. And they are also found all over the planet. So they're always going to be at the top of your food web. So this is one example of trophic levels. And you'll notice one thing is because you only get 10% of energy transferred at each level, kind of the higher up you get, the more stuff you have to eat to maintain body mass. Right, so baleen whales do really well because they eat pretty low on the food chain. In general, things that are really, really big tend to be herbivores, or they eat really, really small primary consumers. The kind of further up you get in the carnivore territory, these things tend not to be that big relatively because they have to eat a lot, and they have to, and remember, not only do they have to eat a lot, they have to run and kill or swim and kill and catch those things to eat them, which takes a lot of energy. So they need to eat a lot, right? Killer whales are big compared to humans. Killer whales are not big compared to baleen whales. Most baleen whales are really big. So getting back to this idea, energy transfer between trophic levels, this is actually a general rule. It's a rule in ecology that about 10% at each level makes it. So you lose 90% of the energy in your food at each level, which is why it's good to eat lower on the food chain because you still have the most out of, or you still have a lot out of that original energy in that particular level, trophic level. And so this is the same kind of idea as this, but I like this example because it puts some numbers on it, and so it gives you it actually starts out with the number 500,000, which is some units of radiant energy that they're getting, whatever. But that goes into phytoplankton, which take that up at, they're saying 2% efficiency. I don't know if that's true or not. You don't have to know for this class. But at phytoplankton, we start at 10,000 units. That's nice. It's metric, right? We're going down by tens, which I like. So phytoplankton, 10,000 units. The herbivores, so these are all little copepods in zooplankton, primary consumers, 1,000 units. So we've gone down 90%. They're eaten by small fish, maybe anchovies, right? They have 100 units of the original energy. That's in the phytoplankton. Those anchovies are eaten by bigger fish. This looks like a tuna to me. 10 units. So we've already gone from 10,000 to 10 units. That's 1,000-fold less energy in this organism. And then finally, this tuna is eaten by humans, and you only get 1 unit out of that original 10,000. So you're going to have to eat a lot of this to make up your diet. So one thing that, yeah, leave it at that. So you lose a lot of energy as you go up, and so you kind of, it's harder to support bigger and bigger biomass since you're losing so much of the energy. Another way to look at this is using a biomass pyramid. Organisms tend to increase in size, but decrease in overall biomass as you move up the pyramid. I gotta admit, I like this figure, but I don't see these a lot in scientific papers. But I study microbes, and so I'm really just looking at this level, so maybe these are common. But I like this because you kind of see the size of the primary producers versus the size of the mako shark. Mako shark's clearly much bigger than this, but in terms of overall biomass in a community, this is where it's at. There's always going to be way more of your primary producers, and less at each successive level. And you can think about this in the other way too, whereas if you start at the top, as you go down towards the primary producers, you're going to get 10 times more biomass at each level. Does that make sense? Okay, let's think about this one more time. And in this slide, we're going to talk about comparing food chains and food webs, which are going to happen in this nebulous region over here. So food chain, simple food chain. Primary producer, herbivore, one or more carnivores. In this case, we have diatoms. What are those 250 waters? That's right, they're phytoplankton. Diatoms are eaten by copepods, which are primary consumers, aka herbivores. We'll talk about them in the next chapter. They're little cute little guys, copepods. Caelinus is a type of copepod. So herbivores eat the plants, and those herbivores are eaten by herring, which is a small fish. That's your whole food chain. Okay, so that's one food chain that fits in the middle of this food web. So this is true. These copepods do eat diatoms, and they are eaten by herring. However, diatoms, well, copepods, these copepods, Caelinus, that particular genus, only eats diatoms. There are other phytoplankton in that food web. There always are. So there's also dinoflagellates, and they're eaten more by mollusks and cladocerans, however you pronounce that. And both of these things are eaten by euphausids, which are like shrimp are euphausids, which are eaten by amphipods, which are eaten by herring. Everything kind of goes up to herring, but you can see there's multiple pathways going to other different copepods, from the diatoms, and even some steps in between the primary consumers and the ultimate apex consumers. This is actually, I'm sorry, this is the North Sea herring, which is a different species than the Newfoundland herring, right? But same thing, where it's a small fish and it's eating a lot of these different things. Where in this case, this is just one pathway within the larger food web. So this gives you a much better idea of what the whole ecosystem looks like. Why stop there, 251ers? Let's look at another food chain example. We have phytoplankton, krill, blue whales. This is in the Antarctic. Right? Phytoplankton have 10 million calories. Krill, you only get 10%. They have 1 million calories, and a whale gets 100,000 calories. That food chain, again, fits into a simplified, this actually can be more complex than this, but it fits into a simplified Antarctic food web, where you have your phytoplankton, krill, and whales. But again, there's a lot of different phytoplankton, so a lot of different things eat phytoplankton. So krill are one of them. They're these giant trip-like looking things. Amphipods are creepier, weirder looking trip-like things that are also zooplankton. And then there's also copepods, which have all kinds of fun shapes. And all three of these things eat phytoplankton, but then they're eaten by various other things that, again, eventually end up being eaten by killer whales because they can't help themselves. They eat everything. They are, again, apex predators of the oceans. They're jerks. Because they play with their food and they kill things that they don't necessarily need to eat. That whole myth of them being super cuddly animals that we go see in SeaWorld They are super smart and interesting, really interesting animals, but they're not that nice. They're called killer whales for a reason. Anyway, apex predators, right? And so a food web, again, this is a very simple lecture. Food chain is showing you kind of one pathway within the larger ecosystem of the food web. And I promise you a short lecture. It's kind of short. That's the end of it. So we needed to talk about these things because I wanted you to understand food chains and food webs. They're important in ecology. When we go on, we're going to talk about different types of fish and different types of benthic habitats and animals that live in those in the next few chapters. And so you really have to understand this. This is kind of the most basic level for that. But it's also important in the next lecture, the last lecture for this chapter. We're going to talk about fisheries. And, you need to understand those topics to understand fisheries as well, and in particular, fisheries management. So I'll take it back to this, leave you with the blue whales getting unfortunately eaten by killer whales. I wouldn't say this happens all the time, by the way, but it has been recorded. You know, as always, do the thing where you're the good people, and I'll see you in the next lecture. Until then, all the stuff that I usually say. See you later.